Samuel Mackenzie sat motionless in his handmade chair, the December wind of 1888 screaming across the Colorado peaks like the ghosts of 10,000 warriors. At 44, his weathered hands held the weight of more death than any man should carry. The cabin around him told the story of 12 years spent in deliberate isolation, 12 years of running from memories that chased him up mountainsides and into valleys where no decent soul would follow. 17 music boxes lined the rough-hewn shelf above his stone fireplace, each one carved from a different wood, each one holding a different melody, each one inscribed with a name that no longer walked this earth. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of detail work that came from hands desperate to stay busy to create beauty in a world that had shown him nothing but ugliness since that terrible day at Antietam. Samuel Mackenzie had been there. September 17, 1862. Company C, 7th Cavalry Regiment. He had watched 23,000 Americans bleed into Maryland soil while generals played chess with human lives. Samuel had lived because Sergeant Major William Cook had ordered him to ride dispatch 20 minutes before the Confederate artillery found their position. 20 minutes that saved his life and damned his soul. The box nearest the fireplace played Martha's favorite waltz, the melody that had filled their little house in Kansas when she would dance with baby Lucy in her arms, spinning around the kitchen table, while Samuel watched from the doorway after his patrol duties. Martha Mackenzie, dead of consumption at 28. Lucy Mackenzie, taken by the same disease 3 months later, calling for her papa while he was riding with a patrol unit 200 miles away, chasing ghost riders who turned out to be shadows and wind. He had found them in the cemetery when he returned. 2 wooden crosses with their names carved deep. The neighbor woman who had watched them die told him Lucy's last words. "Papa coming home soon, Mama. Papa fix everything." But Papa had been hunting phantoms in the desert while his daughter drowned in her own blood. The 17th music box had no name yet. Samuel had been working on it for 3 weeks, carving intricate patterns into the walnut case fitting the tiny brass mechanism that would play whatever melody he chose. He had been planning to carve his own name on the bottom. Tonight, this music box would play its final song. The Colt .45 felt cold against his temple. Samuel had cleaned it that morning, loaded it with care, whispered an apology to every name on every music box. The wind outside sounded like Martha humming. The flames in the fireplace danced like Lucy spinning in her nightgown. 12 years of winter mornings and 12 years of empty evenings and 12 years of talking to no one but his horse and the ghosts that lived in the walls. His finger found the trigger. The cabin held its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then a woman screamed somewhere in the blizzard outside. The sound cut through the storm like a blade through silk. Not the scream of wind or wildlife, but human terror, raw and desperate. Samuel's hand jerked sideways. The gunshot exploded through the cabin, blowing a hole through the ceiling. Snow poured down like frozen tears, landing on his shoulders, his hair melting against the heat of the fire. He stood shaking ears, ringing alive for no good reason he could name. The woman screamed again, fainter now, swallowed by the storm. Samuel dropped the pistol like it had burned him and grabbed his coat from the wooden peg by the door. Samuel's horse Ranger, a black stallion with eyes like coal and a temper to match, screamed from the lean-to stable as Samuel stepped into the storm. Ranger only made that sound for 2 reasons: grizzly bears and death weather. Tonight it was death weather, the kind of Colorado blizzard that killed everything it touched. The wind hit Samuel like a freight train. Snow drove sideways, thick as cotton, turning the familiar world into an alien landscape of white fury. December in the Rocky Mountains didn't negotiate. This storm had been building for days, and now it had arrived with everything it possessed. Samuel leaned into the gale and walked toward the sound of human suffering. His boots punched through drifts that reached his thighs. The old mining road was buried somewhere beneath all this white, the trail that connected his mountain to the town of Elk Crossing, 20 miles below. No sane driver would attempt this road in weather like tonight, but desperation made men attempt impossible things. He found the wreckage 200 yards below his property line. The prison wagon lay on its side in a shallow ravine, one wheel still spinning lazy in the wind. Samuel pulled up short rifle raised by instinct. He waited, listened, let his eyes adjust to the strange light that snow creates bright even in darkness. The horses were down in their traces, 2 dead, 1 dying. The dying one made soft sounds that Samuel couldn't listen to, so he drew his knife and ended it quick. One cut fast and clean. He wiped the blade on his coat and moved toward the overturned wagon. The driver hung from his seat by one arm neck, twisted at an angle that needed no medical examination. Samuel didn't check for a pulse. Didn't need to. 14 years of military service had taught him to recognize a broken neck from 50 feet away. A guard in cavalry blue lay face down in the snow near the scattered contents of the wagon, frozen solid and already beginning to look more like a statue than a man. Another body 10 feet further. Third guard gun still holstered, which meant whatever had happened here had happened fast. Samuel circled the wreck, breathing hard snow, coating his beard white. His boot hit something soft under a drift piled against a boulder. He dropped to his knees and dug with bare hands. Women's clothing came first, but not the fine fabrics of civilization. Buckskin and beadwork decorated in patterns that Samuel recognized from his cavalry days. Apache work, beautiful and functional, and completely wrong for this place and this weather. Then a hand emerged from the snow, small, delicate, with calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. Samuel dug faster. She lay curled on her side arms, wrapped around herself, long black hair frozen to her cheeks. Her skin had taken on the gray pallor of deep hypothermia, lips the color of old ash. Samuel pressed 2 fingers to her throat and held his breath. Nothing at first. He pressed harder, moving his fingers, searching for any sign of life in this frozen woman who should have been dead hours ago. There. A flutter so faint it could have been his own pulse, echoing back, but it wasn't. She was alive. Barely, impossibly, stubbornly alive in a place that should have killed her before the wagon stopped rolling. "All right then," Samuel said through gritted teeth. "All right." He scooped her up carefully. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet buckskin and frozen skin, and whatever stubborn spark inside her that refused to stop burning. Her head fell against his shoulder. Her lips moved without sound, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Apache. She was speaking Apache. Samuel turned uphill toward his cabin. The trail that took 20 minutes in good weather stretched into an hour-long battle against the mountain itself. Every step was a fight against the snow, the wind that tried to tear his burden from his arms. His old wound from Antietam screamed in protest. His lungs burned in the thin air. The voice in his head was harder to ignore than the physical pain. Let her die. She's gone already. You couldn't save Martha. You couldn't save Lucy. You couldn't save any of those boys bleeding out in the Maryland mud. What makes you think you can save this one? Shut up, Samuel said aloud and kept climbing. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside. The fire had burned low while he'd been outside doing what he'd been doing before the scream changed everything. Samuel didn't look at the hole in the ceiling. Didn't look at the place where the gun had been. Just laid the woman on the floor in front of the hearth and threw every piece of split wood onto the coals until the fire roared back to life. Her clothes were killing her. Every layer of buckskin and cotton was soaked through, holding the cold against her skin like an icy shroud. Hypothermia worked from the outside in, and she was already so far gone her lips had turned the color of old pewter. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Forgive me, miss." He cut away her clothes with his skinning knife, working with the clinical precision he had learned in Army field hospitals. Layer after layer of Apache craftsmanship, beautiful beadwork, and intricate stitching that spoke of a culture he had fought against and never understood. When she lay in only a thin cotton undergarment, he wrapped her in the heavy buffalo robe from his own bed and built the fire higher. Then he sat back on his heels and counted her breaths. In, out, in, out. Each breath barely moved the buffalo hide. He counted them the way he used to count ammunition before battle, each one a small victory against the storm still hammering his walls. As he worked to save her life, Samuel noticed details that the darkness and emergency had hidden. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of beauty that belonged in old stories about warrior princesses and medicine women. But there were other things too. Calluses on her hands that spoke of hard labor. Faint scars on her wrists that looked suspiciously like rope burns, and around her neck, almost hidden by her long hair marks that could only have come from iron shackles. This woman hadn't been traveling by choice. She had been a prisoner in that wagon, and now she was dying in his cabin, while the storm that had freed her tried to finish what men had started. Samuel checked her pulse again. Stronger now, though still thread-thin. Color was returning to her face, the gray pallor giving way to something that looked almost human. He added another log to the fire and settled into his chair to wait. 3 hours before dawn, she stirred. The Apache woman's eyes opened like a wildcat waking in a trap. Samuel had been dozing in his chair rifle across his knees out of old habit when the subtle change in her breathing brought him fully alert. Those eyes found him immediately. Dark as midnight, sharp as obsidian, missing nothing. Even half dead from cold and exhaustion, she assessed him with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to evaluate threats in the space of a heartbeat. She didn't scream. Samuel had expected screaming, had braced himself for it. Instead, she went absolutely still, every muscle locked in place while her mind processed the situation. Her gaze tracked from his face to the rifle, to the door to her clothes hanging by the fire, to the buffalo robe covering her body. Mathematics, survival calculations that took maybe 10 seconds. Then she moved faster than a woman half dead from hypothermia had any right to move. The buffalo robe flew off as she rolled backward and came up holding the fire poker from the hearth tools. Both hands on the iron rod feet, spread for balance, every line of her body screaming, "Fight or die." "Stay back," she said in heavily accented English. Her voice cracked with cold and disuse, but the poker didn't waver. "You stay right there." Oh, Samuel raised both hands, palms out. "You're safe. I pulled you out of that wagon wreck, brought you here before you froze to death." "I decide if I'm safe." She adjusted her grip on the poker. "Where am I? Who are you? What did you do to me?" "You're in my cabin on Widow's Peak. My name is Samuel Mackenzie, and I did what needed doing to keep you alive, nothing more." He gestured toward her clothes. "Those were soaked through. Wet clothes kill faster than cold. Had to get them off you or watch you die." "How convenient." The poker pointed at his chest. "Man alone in cabin with unconscious woman. Only did what needed doing." Something in her voice, not just fear, but a particular kind of bitterness, made Samuel look at her differently. This wasn't her first time waking up in a place she didn't choose to be. This wasn't her first time having to fight her way out of a bad situation involving men who claimed they were only trying to help. "I reckon I know what you're thinking," Samuel said carefully, "and I reckon you've got cause to think it. But I'm not whoever taught you to expect the worst from men, miss. I'm just the fool who carried you up a mountain in a blizzard instead of minding my own business." The poker dropped an inch. Something in his tone, maybe the resignation in it, seemed to register. "The wagon, the guards, all dead. I'm sorry." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, tears threatened at the corners, but she held them back through what looked like pure force of will. Samuel recognized that fight. He'd lost it himself enough times. "There was a child," she said. "Patchy boy, maybe 8 years old. Tommy. He showed me how to make bird sounds with grass blades." "I'm sorry," Samuel said again. "He didn't make it." She pressed her fist against her mouth, knuckles white, and fought the grief that wanted to break her. Samuel sat motionless, understanding that this was a private battle, and his job was to stay out of the way. "How long have I been here?" she asked. 3 days. Storm's been going that whole time. Could last another week." "A week?" Her dark eyes flashed to the single window where nothing showed but white fury. "I can't stay here a week." "Mountain doesn't care about your schedule, miss. Storm decides when you leave, not you." She looked at him with an expression that was part calculation, part desperation. 3 days unconscious in a strange man's cabin. 3 days of vulnerability while he could have done anything he wanted. But she was alive, clothed, and he was sitting across the room with his hands visible and his weapon untouched. Slowly, she lowered the poker. Didn't set it down, didn't relax her grip, but lowered it enough that it wasn't pointing at his heart anymore. "My name is Running Wolf," she said. "In English, they call me Rose." "Rose," Samuel repeated. "That's a pretty name." "It was my grandmother's name. She died fighting your cavalry." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel felt the weight of every Apache he had tracked, every village his unit had burned, every order he had followed without question, because that was what soldiers did. The sins of his uniform, his people, his entire race sitting in his cabin wearing his buffalo robe and looking at him with eyes that had seen too much death. "I'm sorry for that too," he said. Rose studied his face for a long moment. "You were cavalry." It wasn't a question. Something in his bearing, his way of sitting, the unconscious military precision in how he maintained his weapons and equipment gave him away. "7th Cavalry, Company C. I rode with units that fought your people. And now you save Apache women from blizzards." Now I try to save anybody who needs saving regardless of what uniform I used to wear. Rose set down the poker. Not because she trusted him, but because something in his tone told her he understood survivor's guilt in ways that most people never would. You carry ghosts. 17 of them. Samuel nodded toward the music boxes on the shelf. Every man in my company who died at Antietam, plus my wife Martha and my daughter Lucy, they died of consumption while I was out chasing shadows in the desert. Rose looked at the music boxes with new understanding. You made those? Everyone. Figured if I could carve their names into wood and give them melodies, maybe the silence wouldn't eat me alive. Does it work? No. The honesty of it seemed to surprise her. Most white men Samuel had known were full of bluster and false confidence. They didn't admit to weakness, didn't acknowledge the ways that war and loss could break a person down to nothing. The boy in the wagon, Rose said quietly. Tommy, what will you carve for him? Samuel looked at the unfinished music box on his workbench. I don't know yet. Maybe that one isn't for the dead. Maybe it's for something else. Rose pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders. The initial adrenaline of waking in a strange place was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and the bone-deep cold that came from nearly dying. But she was alive, and the man across from her didn't seem interested in taking advantage of her vulnerability. I need food, she said. I'll get you some stew, venison and wild onions. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you warm. Samuel ladled stew from the pot hanging over the fire and handed her a wooden bowl. Rose took it with both hands, inhaling the steam. The first spoonful made her realize how hungry she was, how long it had been since she'd eaten anything more substantial than prison slop. This is good, she said, surprised. Don't sound so shocked. I've been feeding myself for 12 years up here. 12 years alone. Mostly alone. Nettie Rollins comes up from Elk Crossing once a month with supplies. She's about the only human company I can tolerate. Rose ate in silence for a few minutes, studying Samuel's face in the firelight. The scar that ran from his left temple down his jaw disappearing into his beard. The lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and snow, and the kind of grief that never fully faded. The careful way he kept his distance, respecting the space she needed to feel safe. Why did you save me? She asked. Heard you screaming. Seemed like the decent thing to do. Decent men don't usually risk their lives for Apache women. Samuel was quiet for a moment. 3 days ago, I put this rifle under my chin and pulled the trigger. Missed because you screamed right as my finger moved. Figured if you saved my life, least I could do was return the favor. Rose stared at him. You were going to kill yourself. Been thinking about it for months. 12 years is a long time to carry ghosts. But you didn't. No, you screamed and I remembered what it sounded like when someone needed help. Rose finished the stew and set down the bowl. For the first time since waking up, she allowed herself to really look around the cabin. Everything had its place. Everything was clean and well-maintained. The furniture was handmade and surprisingly fine-crafted by someone who took pride in his work. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. Shelves held preserved meat flour, coffee, everything a man would need to survive a mountain winter alone. You built all this yourself. Most of it. Had to learn carpentry fast when I moved up here. Mountain doesn't give you much choice about self-sufficiency. Why here? Why this place? Samuel looked toward the window, though there was nothing to see but storm and darkness. Seemed far enough away from people who might ask questions. High enough that the past couldn't follow me. Did it work? No, the past follows you everywhere. Only difference is up here, you don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. Rose stood carefully testing her balance. The buffalo robe dragged on the floor too big for her frame, but it was warm and covered everything that needed covering. She walked to the shelf of music boxes, studying each one with the reverence of someone who understood memorial craftsmanship. Each one has a name, she said, carved on the bottom, and each one plays a different tune. What was your daughter's song? Dancing jig, she loved to dance. Used to spin around our kitchen until she got dizzy and fell down laughing. And your wife? Waltz. Martha loved to waltz. We danced at our wedding until dawn. Rose picked up one of the boxes, a simple design carved from pine. Who was this Private Jenkins? 19 years old? Took a Confederate bullet through the chest and died calling for his mother. She set it down gently and picked up another, more ornate carved from what looked like cherry wood. And this one, Sergeant Major Cook, the man who saved my life by sending me away from the battle. Best soldier I ever knew. Best man, too. Rose worked her way down the line and Samuel told her about each one. 17 stories of men who had died too young, too far from home, their last words echoing across a Maryland hillside while Samuel rode dispatch and lived to carry their memory. When she reached the end of the shelf, she turned back to him. You said 18. I only count 17. Samuel nodded toward his workbench. The 18th isn't finished yet. Don't know what melody to give it. Don't know or don't want to know? The question hit deeper than she probably intended. Samuel looked at the unfinished walnut case, the empty space where the musical mechanism would go, the blank bottom, where a name would be carved. Both maybe. Rose moved to the workbench and picked up the half-finished box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, more detailed than any of the others. Tiny leaves and vines carved into the walnut so delicate they looked like they might move in a breeze. This is beautiful work. Had more time to spend on it. Been working on it for months. Since you started thinking about the rifle. Samuel nodded. Rose turned the box over in her hands, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Maybe the 18th box isn't for the dead. What would it be for the living, the people who survive, the ones who have to figure out what comes next? Samuel looked at her, standing in his buffalo robe in front of his workbench, holding his unfinished music box like it was something precious. 3 days ago, he had been ready to die alone on this mountain, another casualty of a war that had ended 26 years ago. Now there was a woman in his cabin, an Apache woman who understood loss and survival and the way grief could carve itself into your bones. I should show you where you can sleep, he said. There's a loft upstairs, straw mattress, warm blankets. You'll be comfortable enough. And you? I'll sleep down here by the fire. Keep it going, make sure the cabin stays warm. Rose climbed the ladder to the loft, the buffalo robe wrapped around her like a royal cape. At the top, she paused and looked down at him. Samuel. Yeah. Thank you for pulling me out of the snow, for not being the kind of man I was afraid you might be. Thank you for screaming at the right time. She disappeared into the loft and Samuel heard her settling onto the straw mattress. From above came the soft sounds of someone trying not to cry, the kind of grieving done in private when you think no one can hear. Samuel picked up the unfinished music box and turned it in his hands. For months, he had been trying to decide what name to carve on the bottom. Samuel Mackenzie seemed like the obvious choice, the final entry in his catalog of the dead. But Rose was right. Maybe the 18th box wasn't for the dead at all. He set it back on the workbench and banked the fire for the night. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin felt different than it had in 12 years. Not empty anymore. Not full of ghosts whispering in every shadow. For the first time since Martha and Lucy died, Samuel Mackenzie fell asleep without hearing the sound of his daughter, calling for a papa who would never come home. Rose woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of hammering. She lay still for a moment in the straw mattress, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the absence of iron shackles around her wrists. Above her rough-hewn rafters, below her the steady rhythm of a hammer striking wood. Through the small loft window, weak sunlight filtered through still falling snow. Memory crashed back like cold water. The wagon, the crash, Tommy's small body still and frozen in the snow. The man downstairs who had carried her through a blizzard and asked for nothing in return except the chance to keep them both alive. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry and warm from hanging by the fire. The buckskin felt strange after 3 days of cotton and buffalo hide, but it was familiar weight, familiar protection. As she climbed down the ladder, she saw Samuel standing on a chair beneath the ceiling, nailing a square of wood over the bullet hole his interrupted suicide had left behind. Coffee's on the fire, he said without looking at her. Biscuits aren't fancy, but they'll fill the empty spaces. What time is it? Past dawn. Storm's weakening, but we're still locked in for at least another day. Rose poured coffee into a tin cup, black and strong enough to wake the dead. She drank it without complaint and picked up one of the biscuits from the plate Samuel had set out. Dense and dry, but like he'd said, it filled the empty spaces. You fixed the ceiling, she observed. Needed fixing. Because of the hole. Because of the hole. Neither of them said what had made the hole. It sat between them like a third person in the room, the ghost of Samuel's despair and the random chance that had saved both their lives. Rose examined the cabin more carefully in daylight. What had seemed sparse and utilitarian by firelight revealed itself as the work of a craftsman. The table surface was smooth as glass. The chairs had curved backs that fit the human spine perfectly. Every tool had its place, every surface was clean, every corner spoke of a man who had built a life alone and made it work through sheer determination and skill. How long have you been up here? 12 years this spring. Always alone. Nettie Rollins brings supplies from Elk Crossing once a month. She's the postmistress and general store owner and about 60% of everybody's business. Only person in 40 miles I can tolerate, and some months that's a stretch. You don't like people. People are fine. It's caring about them that'll kill you. He said it flat like a man reporting the weather. No self-pity, no drama, just a truth he'd learned through hard experience and filed under lessons never to forget. Rose studied his profile as he worked. The scar that marked his face told a story of violence survived, but his movements were careful and precise, the actions of a man who had learned to channel destructive impulses into creative work. The music boxes on the shelf weren't just memorials. They were proof that Samuel Mackenzie had found a way to make beauty from grief, even if that beauty hadn't healed the wounds that created it. The wagon I was in, she said carefully, it wasn't the first. Samuel's hammer paused for just a second, then resumed its rhythm. No, I don't imagine it was. There have been others, dozens of others, Apache women and children taken from the reservation and sold to men who collect us like livestock. Who's doing the selling? Government men, Indian agents, anyone with enough authority to move people without questions being asked. Rose's voice hardened. The man who bought me calls himself Colonel Hartwell. Used to be real cavalry, now he's something worse. Samuel climbed down from the chair and turned to face her. Something in his gray eyes had changed, sharpened, taken on the calculating look of a man who had spent years planning military operations. Theodore Hartwell. You know him. I know of him. He was a captain when I knew him, stationed at Fort Riley. Smart, ambitious, completely without conscience when it came to dealing with tribes. He's a colonel now, and he's not just dealing with tribes anymore. He's buying and selling them. Samuel set down his hammer and poured himself coffee. His movements were controlled, but Rose could see the anger building beneath the surface like steam in a kettle. How did he get you? Rose was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who had learned to report atrocities without letting them destroy her. Reservation agents came to our village 3 months ago, said there had been complaints about Apache raiding, said we needed to be relocated for our own protection. My father Gray Wolf is chief of our band. He argued, but the soldiers had guns and we had children to protect. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that looked nothing like the high desert country of her birth. They separated the families, women and children in one wagon train, men in another. Told us we were going to different reservations, that we would be reunited once the paperwork was complete. The men's wagons went south toward Mexico. We went north. Toward buyers. Toward buyers. Hartwell has a list of clients. Rich men in big cities who want exotic servants. Apache women are prized because we're strong. We work hard, and we're supposedly more docile than other tribes. Samuel made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. Whoever told him Apache women are docile never met any Apache women. That's what I told Hartwell when he tried to train me. Rose rolled up her sleeves, revealing scars on her forearms that Samuel had noticed before but hadn't wanted to ask about. Thin white lines, too regular to be accidental, too numerous to be from casual violence. He's very patient, very systematic. He believes any woman can be broken if you apply the right pressure in the right places for long enough. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen torture during the war, had witnessed what men could do to other men when they believed themselves justified by uniform or cause or simple expedience. But there was something particularly evil about the methodical breaking of another human being, the slow destruction of will and spirit, and the fundamental sense of self. How did you survive it? My grandmother's stories. She used to tell me about the old days when Apache women were warriors as well as mothers and wives. She said that true strength wasn't in the body, it was in the spirit, and no one could touch your spirit unless you let them. Rose pulled her sleeves back down, covering the evidence of Hartwell's patience. I let him think he was winning, pretended to be broken, to be grateful for his kindness, to be eager to please whatever buyer he found for me. But inside I was planning. Planning what? Escape, always escape. Every Apache woman knows that slavery is worse than death, and death is better than surrender. Samuel nodded slowly. It was the warrior's code, the same philosophy that had made the Apaches such formidable enemies during the long years of the Indian Wars. Never surrender, never submit, fight until you can't fight anymore, and then keep fighting anyway. The buyer Hartwell found for me lives in Denver. Rich man, they said, collects Indian artifacts and wanted a real Apache woman to complete his collection. Rose's voice was steady, but her hands clenched into fists. The wagon was taking me there when the storm hit. Storm might have saved your life. Storm definitely saved my life. Hartwell's men were planning to kill me before we reached Denver. I heard them talking. Seems the buyer changed his mind, decided he wanted a younger girl instead. But Hartwell had already spent the money, so killing me and reporting that I died in the crash was easier than giving refunds. Samuel felt the familiar cold rage that had gotten him in trouble during his military service. The same fury that had driven him to volunteer for the most dangerous missions, the same need to make the bastards pay for their cruelty that had nearly gotten him court-martialed twice. Where is he now? Hartwell, I don't know. Probably back in Colorado territory, shopping for new inventory. The Indian agencies make it easy for him. All he has to do is file the right paperwork, claim there's been trouble with a particular band, and suddenly he has authorization to relocate them anywhere he wants. Samuel was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, like it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. Finally, he looked up at Rose. You can't go back to your people. If Hartwell thinks you're dead, going back to the reservation will let him know you survived. He'll come for you again. I know. You can't go to the authorities. He's got enough legitimate paperwork to make any complaints look like the ravings of an ungrateful savage. I know that too. So what's your plan? Rose smiled, and for the first time since Samuel had pulled her from the snow, it reached her eyes. I don't have a plan. For 3 months, every day was planned for me. When I ate, when I slept, when I spoke, when I stayed silent. Every moment controlled by someone else's will. Right now, not having a plan feels like freedom. Samuel understood. He had felt the same way when he first came to the mountain, the relief of being responsible to no one but himself, answerable to nothing but his own choices and the weather. You could stay here, he said, then immediately regretted the words. I mean until you figure out what comes next. Mountain's big enough for 2 people, and winter's coming, whether we're ready or not. Rose studied his face carefully. You're offering me sanctuary. I'm offering you time to heal, time to think, time to decide what kind of life you want to build now that you're free to build it. And what do you get in return? Honest answer. Honest answer. Company that's not ghosts. Someone to talk to besides my horse. Maybe a reason to keep that rifle on the wall instead of under my chin. Rose moved to the workbench and picked up the unfinished music box. What would you carve on this one if it's for the living instead of the dead? Samuel joined her at the workbench, standing close enough that he could smell the pine smoke in her hair, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to remember what it felt like to want something besides an end to the pain. I don't know yet. Maybe it doesn't need a name. Maybe it just needs a melody. What kind of melody? Something new. Something that isn't about looking backward. Rose set the music box back on the workbench and turned to face him. Samuel Mackenzie, are you asking me to help you learn how to live again? Rose Running Wolf, I think maybe I am. The silence that followed was different from the empty silence that had filled the cabin for 12 years. This silence was full of possibilities, heavy with the weight of 2 people standing at the edge of something that might be hope or might be disaster, but was definitely not the slow death they had both been dying before the storm brought them together. Outside, the wind began to die down for the first time in 4 days. The blizzard that had killed 5 people and nearly killed Rose was finally releasing its grip on the Colorado mountains. Soon the world would start moving again, and they would have to decide what place they wanted to occupy in it. But for now, they had time. Time to learn each other's stories, time to discover whether two broken people could help each other heal, time to find out if the music box on the workbench really was meant for the living instead of the dead. Samuel picked up his carving knife and began working on the intricate pattern of leaves and vines that decorated the walnut case. Rose watched his hands move with the precision of someone who had learned to create beauty as an antidote to ugliness. "Teach me," she said. "Teach you what? How to carve, how to make something beautiful from nothing, how to turn pain into something useful." Samuel handed her a smaller knife and a block of pine wood. "Pine's forgiving, good for learning. You can make mistakes and the wood won't break on you." Rose took the knife and wood, testing the weight and balance. Her hands were smaller than Samuel's, but strong and sure from years of Apache craftsmanship. "What should I make?" "Whatever wants to come out of the wood. Sometimes you don't know what you're carving until it's finished." As Rose began to work carefully shaving thin curls from the pine block, Samuel realized something that surprised him. For the first time in 12 years, the silence in his cabin didn't feel like death. It felt like possibility. The storm was ending, but something new was just beginning. And whatever melody the 18th music box would play, Samuel knew it wouldn't be a funeral song. The smoke signals appeared on the 7th day after the storm broke. Samuel spotted them first from the cabin's eastern window, thin gray columns rising from the valley floor like fingers pointing toward heaven. 3 distinct plumes spaced evenly across the horizon, sending a message in a language he couldn't read but understood in his bones. Someone was looking for something. Someone with enough Apache knowledge to use traditional communication methods. "Rose," he called quietly, "come see this." She joined him at the window, her face going pale when she saw the signals. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, reading the smoke with the fluency of someone raised in a culture where such messages could mean the difference between life and death. "What do they say?" Samuel asked. "They're looking for me. 3 parties coordinated search pattern. They know I survived the crash." "Hartwell's men," Rose shook her head slowly. "No, these are Apache signals. Traditional patterns my people have used for generations." Her voice carried a mixture of hope and fear. "It's Grey Wolf, my brother. He's come looking for me." Samuel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. For 7 days, he and Rose had existed in a bubble of isolation, learning each other's stories, sharing the careful intimacy of 2 damaged people, discovering they might be able to heal together. Now the outside world was intruding, bringing with it all the complications they had been avoiding. How many men would he bring along? Enough to fight if he has to. Grey Wolf doesn't do anything halfway. Rose moved away from the window, her Apache instincts already shifting into survival mode. "We need to prepare. He'll be here before nightfall." They spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin and preparing for what might be either a reunion or a siege. Samuel cleaned his rifles and checked his ammunition, while Rose gathered herbs and prepared traditional Apache medicines. Both of them worked with the efficient movements of people who had learned that survival often depended on preparation and attention to detail. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, they came. Samuel counted 8 riders picking their way up the mountain trail, moving with the patient precision of Apache warriors who knew that haste in dangerous terrain could be fatal. They wore a mixture of traditional and military clothing, some carrying rifles, others armed with traditional weapons that had served their people for generations before the white man came. The man in the lead rode a paint horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Even at a distance, Samuel could see the family resemblance. Grey Wolf had the same sharp cheekbones as his sister, the same dark eyes that missed nothing, the same proud bearing that marked him as someone accustomed to command. "He looks like you," Samuel observed. "He acts like me too. Stubborn, prideful, convinced he knows what's best for everyone around him." "Sounds familiar." Rose shot him a look that was part irritation, part amusement. "I'm nothing like that." "Whatever you say, Princess." The rider stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough away to retreat if things went badly. Grey Wolf dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible but ready to move toward his weapons if necessary. "My sister," he called in English accented but clear, "I have come to take you home." Rose stepped out of the cabin, Samuel beside her. The reunion between brother and sister was complicated by 3 months of separation trauma and the presence of a white man who had become something more than a rescuer. Grey Wolf. Rose's voice carried years of shared history, childhood memories, and the complex bonds of family that had survived everything the world had thrown at them. You shouldn't have come. It's dangerous. Dangerous for who? The men who took you are dead. The storm killed them, and now you are safe. Time to come home. I am home. The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a gun barrel. Grey Wolf's eyes shifted to Samuel, cataloging him with the same calculating assessment Rose had used 7 days ago. Former military dangerous but not immediately threatening, standing close enough to Rose to suggest intimacy, but not so close as to claim ownership. This is the man who found you. This is Samuel Mackenzie. He saved my life, for which I am grateful. Grey Wolf's tone suggested gratitude that had limits. But gratitude does not change what must be done. You belong with your people, not with strangers. He's not a stranger anymore. Grey Wolf studied his sister's face, reading the subtle signs that years of shared experience had taught him to recognize. Rose had made her choice, and arguing with her when she had made up her mind was like arguing with a mountain storm. The white man has been kind to you. The white man has a name, Samuel said mildly, and he's standing right here. Samuel Mackenzie. Grey Wolf tested the name like he was tasting something unfamiliar. You rode with the cavalry. I did. You fought against our people. I did that too. And now you claim my sister. I don't claim anybody. Your sister is free to make her own choices. Grey Wolf drew his knife and pointed it at Samuel. You come with us now or you stay here forever. Rose stepped between them. No, brother, I choose to stay. Then you choose to die to your people. Then I choose to be reborn to myself. The confrontation hung in the air like a blade balanced on its edge. Samuel could see the war in Grey Wolf's face, love for his sister battling against Apache tradition, and the practical necessity of keeping his people safe. Finally, Grey Wolf lowered his knife. There are things you both need to know, he said. Colonel Hartwell is not finished with you, Rose. He knows you survived the wagon crash. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. How? One of his men survived, found half dead by a trapping party 2 days after the storm. He told Hartwell about the Apache woman who was in the wagon, described you well enough that Hartwell knew exactly who had gotten away. Samuel moved closer to Rose, not protectively, but supportively, the way a partner moves when trouble is coming and they need to face it together. How many men does he have? More than before. Hartwell has convinced the territorial government that a dangerous Apache band has been raiding settlements. He has authorization to use military resources to track down the survivors. How many? Samuel asked again. 40 soldiers, professional trackers, enough firepower to level this mountain if necessary. Rose closed her eyes, absorbing the implications. Hartwell wasn't just pursuing a piece of lost property anymore. He was conducting a military operation with government backing and unlimited resources. When will they get here? Soon. Maybe days, maybe hours. Hartwell is not a patient man when it comes to things he considers his property. Samuel felt the familiar cold calculation that had kept him alive through 14 years of military service. 40 men was too many to fight directly, but mountains provided advantages that numbers couldn't overcome. The real question was whether Grey Wolf and his warriors would stand with them or try to take Rose back to safety. I have a proposal, Samuel said. Your sister has information that could destroy Hartwell. Knowledge about his trafficking operation, the names of buyers, the corruption that makes it possible. Help us expose him, and you'll be protecting not just Rose, but every Apache woman and child he might target in the future. Grey Wolf considered this. Revenge was a concept that Apache culture understood well, but it had to be balanced against the practical necessity of keeping his people alive. What kind of help do you need? Warriors who know how to fight in mountains. Knowledge of trails that cavalry can't follow. Time to gather evidence and get it to people who can act on it. And in return, Samuel looked at Rose. Your sister gets to choose her own life. No pressure from me, no demands from you. She decides what she wants, and we support that decision. Rose felt a surge of gratitude toward both men. In a world where women were often treated as property to be traded between men, here were two warriors offering her something precious: agency. I choose to fight, she said. Hartwell destroyed my family, sold my people, turned me into a commodity to be bought and sold. I want him stopped, and I want to be part of stopping him. Grey Wolf nodded slowly. Then we fight together. But if this goes badly, if the cavalry is too strong, you come with us to Mexico. There are places there where even Hartwell's reach cannot follow. Agreed. Samuel extended his hand to Grey Wolf. The Apache warrior looked at it for a moment, then clasped it in the traditional grip of men who were about to trust each other with their lives. How long do we have? Samuel asked. Not long enough. Hartwell's trackers are good, and he has maps of this entire region. He'll find this place within days. Rose moved to stand between the two men who represented the different worlds she was trying to bridge. Then we don't wait for him to find us. We take the fight to him. What do you mean? Grey Wolf asked. Hartwell's operation depends on official paperwork and government cooperation. But it also depends on secrecy. If we can expose what he's doing, make it public force the territorial authorities to investigate, we can destroy him without firing a shot. Samuel nodded approvingly. Hit him where he's vulnerable. Make him fight on our terms instead of his. The nearest telegraph office is in Elk Crossing, Rose continued. If we can get word to newspaper editors in Denver and Colorado Springs, create enough public pressure, even bought officials will have to respond. Grey Wolf smiled for the first time since arriving. My sister always was the smartest one in the family. As night fell around the cabin, the three of them planned their assault on Colonel Theodore Hartwell's empire. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, and almost certainly their only chance to end the threat that hung over Rose's life and the lives of countless other Apache women. Samuel looked at the unfinished music box on his workbench and realized he finally knew what melody it would play. Not a funeral song for the dead, but a battle hymn for the living. The ride to Elk Crossing took them through terrain that seemed designed to test both horse and rider. Grey Wolf had left 6 of his warriors hidden in the high country, ready to provide covering fire or create diversions if Hartwell's men got too close. Samuel, Rose, and Grey Wolf traveled light and fast, following game trails that military maps didn't show, and civilian surveyors had never bothered to explore. Rose rode between the two men, equally comfortable on horseback and equally deadly with the rifle Samuel had taught her to use with precision. 3 days of hard travel had forged them into something approaching a functional unit, though the undercurrents of tension between her brother and her rescuer remained just beneath the surface. Tell me about this Jake Morrison, Grey Wolf said as they descended toward the valley where Elk Crossing nestled like a collection of children's toys. Telegraph operator, good man mostly. We served together briefly before I mustered out. He's honest, which in this territory makes him unusual. Can we trust him with this? Samuel considered the question carefully. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed if you gave it to the wrong person, but some operations required taking calculated risks with people who might surprise you. Jake's got no love for corrupt officials. His younger brother died in a skirmish that was started by an Indian agent selling rifles to both sides. If we can make him understand what Hartwell is doing, he'll help. Elk Crossing looked like 100 other frontier towns Samuel had seen during his years of military service. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a scattering of houses and businesses, the inevitable saloon and general store and church that marked civilization's tentative foothold in wild country. The telegraph office occupied a corner of the railroad station, a small building that connected this remote outpost to the larger world beyond the mountains. Jake Morrison looked older than Samuel remembered, his hair gone gray at the temples and his face marked by the kind of weariness that came from watching the world disappoint you more often than it surprised you. But his eyes sharpened when he recognized Samuel through the office window, and his handshake was still firm when they met at the back door of the telegraph building. Sam Mackenzie, heard you'd gone mountain man, disappeared into the high country to commune with nature and your own demons. Something like that. Jake, I need your help with something that's bigger than personal problems. Jake looked past Samuel to Rose and Grey Wolf, both of whom were trying to look inconspicuous while remaining ready to fight or flee depending on how this conversation developed. Apache friends, the best kind of friends, the kind who'll die for what's right and kill for what's wrong. And what's wrong that requires Apache allies and telegraph messages. Samuel spent the next 20 minutes explaining Hartwell's operation, Rose's experiences, and the systematic trafficking of Apache women and children that was being conducted under the cover of official government business. Jake listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the scope of the corruption became clear. But as they prepared to leave, Jake's expression changed. Sam, I'm sorry about this. Three cavalry soldiers stepped from behind the telegraph equipment, rifles raised. Hartwell's been paying me for information about unusual activity in the territory. I never thought it would lead to this. Rose felt the betrayal like a physical blow. You sold us out. I needed the money. My wife is sick, and the medicine cost more than I make in 6 months. Hartwell promised me enough to get her real treatment in Denver. Grey Wolf's hand moved toward his knife, but Samuel caught his wrist. How long have you been working for him? 2 years. Nothing serious, just reports about strange visitors, unusual telegraph traffic, anything that might interest the territorial government. The messages you sent yesterday, Samuel said with growing understanding. You told Hartwell about those too. Jake nodded miserably. He was here within hours. Said you were dangerous fugitives, that helping you would make me an accessory to serious crimes. The lead cavalry soldier, a sergeant with the weathered look of a professional, stepped forward. Samuel Mackenzie Rose Running Wolf. You're under arrest by order of Colonel Theodore Hartwell. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. Rose looked around the telegraph office, calculating distances and angles. Three soldiers with rifles, Jake Morrison cowering behind his equipment, Grey Wolf coiled like a spring, ready to unleash violence. The odds weren't good, but they weren't impossible either. Jake, she said quietly, your wife. What's her name? Mary Morrison. How long have you been married? 15 years next month. Do you love her more than anything? Rose nodded toward the soldiers. These men work for a man who buys and sells women like livestock, who tortures them until they are broken, then ships them to buyers who treat them like exotic pets. Is that the kind of money you want to use to save your wife? Jake's face crumpled. I didn't know. Hartwell said you were criminals, that you'd stolen government property and killed federal agents. The only thing I stole was my own freedom. The only people I've killed were trying to put me back in chains. The sergeant was getting impatient. Enough talk. You're coming with us, and if you resist, we'll drag you back to Colonel Hartwell in whatever condition we find you. Grey Wolf moved faster than any of the soldiers expected. His knife took the sergeant in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. Rose dove for the weapon while Samuel tackled the second soldier, using his superior size and experience to drive the man into the wall with enough force to crack ribs. The third soldier managed to get off one shot before Grey Wolf's knife found his throat. The bullet went wide, shattering a window and sending glass cascading onto the street outside. In less than 30 seconds, 3 trained cavalry soldiers were dead or disabled, and the telegraph office looked like a battlefield. Jake Morrison crouched behind his equipment, shaking with terror and the realization that he had aligned himself with the wrong side. Are you hurt? Samuel asked Rose. No, fine, Grey Wolf. The sergeant will live, but he won't be using that arm for months. Rose picked up one of the fallen rifles and pointed it at Jake Morrison. You're going to send new messages to every newspaper editor, every federal marshal, every honest official you can reach. You're going to tell them exactly what Colonel Hartwell is doing, and you're going to make sure they understand that this is bigger than 3 fugitives hiding in the mountains. They won't believe me. Hartwell has connections, influence. He'll discredit anything I say. Then we'll give them proof they can't ignore. Samuel was already going through the papers on Hartwell's wounded sergeant, looking for anything that might document the colonel's activities. In the man's saddlebags, he found what he was looking for: correspondence between Hartwell and his buyers, shipping manifests disguised as prisoner transfer orders, financial records that showed payments far in excess of normal military expenses. This is it, he said, showing the documents to Rose and Grey Wolf. Evidence of the entire operation, names, dates, amounts, everything we need to destroy him. Rose looked at Jake Morrison with something that might have been pity. Your wife, Jake, you want to save her with blood money, or you want to save her by doing the right thing? Jake stared at the documents in Samuel's hands, then at the wounded sergeant who was groaning on the floor of his office. Finally, he moved to his telegraph key and began composing messages that would reach every corner of the Colorado Territory and beyond. The clicking of Morse code filled the small office as Jake Morrison sent the information that would destroy Colonel Theodore Hartwell's trafficking empire. Message after message, each one carrying the names and details that would force investigations, expose corruption, and make it impossible for Hartwell to continue his crimes. When he finished, Jake looked up at the 3 people who had turned his world upside down. What happens now? Now we disappear, Samuel said, and you forget you ever saw us. What about Hartwell? He'll come looking for you. Let him come, Rose said. We'll be ready for him. They left Elk Crossing as quietly as they had entered, following a trail that led into the mountains towards Samuel's cabin, but would branch off long before reaching that destination. Behind them, Jake Morrison was binding the wounds of Hartwell's sergeant and preparing to explain to his superiors how 3 fugitives had outfought 3 professional soldiers in his telegraph office. But the damage was done. The messages had been sent, the evidence was spreading across the territory, and Colonel Theodore Hartwell's empire was beginning to crumble from the inside out. Where to now? Grey Wolf asked as they climbed into the foothills. Up, Samuel said. High country. Let them chase us through terrain that favors defenders over attackers. They rode toward the mountains as the sun set behind them, 3 people who had chosen to fight against impossible odds rather than accept the injustices of a system that treated human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. Behind them, the telegraph wires carried their story to every corner of the American frontier. Ahead of them lay the high country where they would make their stand against Colonel Theodore Hartwell and the forces of corruption he represented. Samuel looked back once at the valley where Elk Crossing lay hidden in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that town, Jake Morrison was learning what it meant to choose between money and conscience, between security and justice, between the easy path and the right path. Samuel hoped the man would choose well, but either way the die was cast and there was no going back now. The trail they followed led through some of the most spectacular and unforgiving country in the Colorado Territory. High meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion, then rocky passes where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into canyons so deep the bottom disappeared in shadow. This was Apache country in spirit, if not in law, the kind of terrain where small groups of determined fighters could hold off much larger forces through superior knowledge of the ground and willingness to take risks that civilized armies considered suicidal. As night fell, they made camp in a hidden valley where a stream provided fresh water and the surrounding ridges offered multiple escape routes if they needed to move quickly. Grey Wolf took the first watch while Samuel and Rose huddled near a small fire, talking quietly about the challenges that lay ahead. Your brother doesn't trust me, Samuel observed. He doesn't trust any white man. Our experience with your people hasn't encouraged trust. Can't blame him for that. Question is whether he trusts you. Rose poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Grey Wolf loves me, but he thinks love gives him the right to make decisions for me. It's a failing common to men of all races. I don't want to make decisions for you. I know. That's why I'm here instead of riding south toward Mexico with my brother's warriors. Samuel moved closer to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold mountain air. Rose, when this is over, when Hartwell is stopped and you're safe, what do you want? I want a life I choose for myself. I want to wake up in the morning without wondering if someone is going to put chains on me before nightfall. I want to matter to someone without being owned by them. You matter to me. I know that too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals while Grey Wolf kept watch from a ridge above their camp. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new tests of their ability to work together, despite their different backgrounds and the weight of history that lay between their peoples. But tonight they had peace, a small island of safety in a world that wanted to destroy them, a moment of quiet intimacy between 2 people who had found each other in a blizzard and discovered they might be able to build something worth protecting. Samuel reached into his saddlebags and withdrew the nearly finished music box, its walnut case gleaming in the firelight. I've been thinking about what melody this should play. What did you decide? Something hopeful, something that looks forward instead of backward. Rose took the music box and turned it in her hands, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by Samuel's patient craftsmanship. Play it for me when we get through this. When we get through this, I'll play it for you every morning and every evening for as long as you want to hear it. That might be a very long time. I'm counting on it. Dawn came gray and cold with the kind of mountain chill that promised snow before nightfall. Grey Wolf descended from his watch position with news that would complicate their already dangerous situation. Trackers, he reported tersely. Professional hunters, not cavalry soldiers. They found our trail, leaving Elk Crossing, and they're following it with more skill than I expected from white men. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. How many? 6 that I could see. But they're not traveling alone. There's a larger force behind them, maybe half a day back. Hartwell is using the trackers to find us, then bringing up his main force to finish the job. Rose began packing their camp with the efficient movements of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to move fast when circumstances demanded it. How long before they reach us? 4 hours, maybe 5 if we're lucky, and they have to work around some of the false trails I left yesterday. Samuel studied the terrain around their valley, calculating distances and angles like the military tactician he had been trained to be. The high country offered advantages to defenders, but only if they could choose the ground where they made their stand. Being caught in the open by superior numbers would end badly for everyone. There's an old silver mine about 2 hours north of here, he said. Abandoned for 10 years, but the tunnels are still solid. We could make a stand there, force them to come at us through narrow passages where numbers don't matter as much. Grey Wolf shook his head. Trap ourselves underground with no way out. That's a good way to die slowly instead of quickly. Better than dying in the open where they can use their cavalry training against us. Rose looked between the two men, recognizing the beginning of the kind of argument that could get them all killed if they didn't resolve it quickly. What if we don't make a stand at all? What if we stay ahead of them until the newspaper stories force Hartwell to call off his pursuit? Can't outrun cavalry forever, Samuel said. Horses get tired, supplies run out, winter weather makes travel impossible. Eventually they'll corner us. Then we make them pay a price for cornering us. Rose's voice carried the steel that had helped her survive 3 months as Hartwell's prisoner. We're not helpless victims running from predators. We're Apache warriors and a veteran cavalry soldier. If Hartwell wants us, he can come and take us. Grey Wolf smiled with pride at his sister's defiance. Now you sound like our grandmother's granddaughter. They broke camp and began climbing toward the higher elevations where winter arrived early and stayed late, where the air was thin enough to challenge horses and riders unaccustomed to altitude, where a knowledge of the terrain could mean the difference between escape and capture. Behind them, the trackers continued their patient pursuit, following sign that was growing fresher with each passing hour. The silver mine Samuel had mentioned occupied a shelf of rock on the side of a mountain that thrust up from the surrounding peaks like a stone finger pointing toward heaven. The mine itself was a black mouth in the gray granite, surrounded by the debris of a mining operation that had extracted millions of dollars in silver before the vein played out, and the company moved on to more profitable locations. Defensible, Grey Wolf admitted as they studied the approach to the mine. Good fields of fire, limited access routes, water from the stream below. And if they bottle us up in there, we die of thirst or starvation instead of bullets, Samuel pointed out. Rose dismounted and began examining the mine entrance and the surrounding terrain with the systematic thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail. There are other ways out. Look at the ventilation shafts, the drainage tunnels. This mine has at least 3 exits that I can see from here. Samuel and Grey Wolf joined her exploration, and gradually a defensive plan began to take shape. The main tunnel could be defended by 1 or 2 people, while the others used alternate routes to attack the besiegers from unexpected directions. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being caught in the open by 40 cavalry soldiers. They had just finished positioning their supplies and ammunition when Grey Wolf's sharp ears picked up the sound of approaching horses. The trackers had made better time than expected, and behind them came the dust cloud that marked the approach of Hartwell's main force. Here they come, Samuel said, checking his rifle and settling into position behind a boulder that offered both protection and a clear view of the approaches to the mine. Rose took position at the mine entrance, her own rifle ready and her Apache training evident in the way she blended into the shadows of the tunnel mouth. Grey Wolf disappeared entirely, vanishing into the broken terrain above the mine, where he could observe the enemy's movements and strike from cover if the opportunity arose. The first tracker to come into view was a lean man with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life reading sign in difficult country. He approached the mine with the caution of a professional who understood that cornered prey was often the most dangerous prey. Behind him, 5 more trackers spread out to cover all the possible escape routes while they waited for the cavalry to arrive. Colonel Theodore Hartwell himself rode at the head of the main force when it finally appeared. Even at a distance, Samuel could see why the man had been successful in both military and civilian careers. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command, and his movements suggested a mind that was both intelligent and utterly without conscience when it came to achieving his objectives. Rose Running Wolf, Hartwell's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. I know you can hear me. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, but I'm prepared to be reasonable about this situation. Rose didn't answer, but Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders as she heard the voice of the man who had tortured her for 3 months. I have 40 men with me, Hartwell continued. Enough firepower to turn that mine into your tomb if necessary. But I'd prefer to resolve this without bloodshed. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee the safety of your companions. Liar, Rose whispered, but she didn't raise her voice loud enough for Hartwell to hear. You have 1 hour to consider my offer, the colonel announced. After that, I'll be forced to use more direct methods. The cavalry force withdrew to positions that surrounded the mine, but remained outside rifle range. Samuel could see Hartwell setting up what looked like a field headquarters, complete with maps and communication equipment. The man was treating this like a formal military operation, which meant he had resources and patience that could outlast any siege the defenders could mount. He's not bluffing, Samuel said quietly. 40 trained soldiers with artillery support can take this position eventually. Then we don't let them take it, Rose replied. We make them pay such a price that continuing the attack becomes more expensive than letting us go. Grey Wolf materialized beside them as quietly as he had disappeared. I counted the men and equipment. He has a small cannon, enough ammunition for a week-long siege and supply lines that stretch back to Elk Crossing. This isn't a manhunt anymore. It's a military campaign. Samuel felt a familiar calm settle over him, the battlefield awareness that had kept him alive through 14 years of military service. When the situation became impossible, when survival required more than hope and luck, a good soldier focused on the immediate tactical problems and let larger strategic concerns take care of themselves. Rose, can you hit that officer talking to Hartwell? The one with the brass on his collar. She studied the target through her rifle sights. Difficult shot, but possible. Why? Because if we're going to make them pay a price, we need to start with the people who make the decisions. Rose lined up her shot with the patient precision Samuel had taught her during their days in the cabin. When she fired, the cavalry lieutenant spun and fell, clutching his shoulder where her bullet had found its mark. Not a killing shot, but enough to send a message that the people in the mine were serious about defending themselves. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Rifle fire erupted from a dozen positions as the cavalry soldiers sought cover and began returning fire with the disciplined volleys of professional soldiers. Bullets rang off the granite walls of the mine entrance and whined through the air above their heads like angry hornets. Now it gets interesting, Samuel muttered, settling into the rhythm of aimed fire that had served him well in half a dozen major battles during his military career. The siege of the silver mine had begun, and for the first time since Rose had crashed into his life, Samuel Mackenzie felt completely alive. The siege of the silver mine lasted 18 hours before Colonel Hartwell made his fatal mistake. For most of that time, the engagement had followed the predictable pattern of professional soldiers attacking a defensive position held by determined but outnumbered defenders. Hartwell's men had probed for weaknesses, tested the range and accuracy of the defenders' fire, and gradually tightened their cordon around the mine entrance. Samuel Rose and Grey Wolf had responded with the disciplined fire of people who understood that ammunition was precious and every shot had to count. But as dawn broke over the Colorado peaks, painting the granite walls of the canyon in shades of gold and crimson, Hartwell's patience finally snapped. Perhaps it was the knowledge that newspaper editors in Denver and Colorado Springs were already asking questions about his activities. Perhaps it was the realization that every hour this siege continued increased the risk that federal investigators would begin looking into his operations. Or perhaps it was simply the wounded pride of a man who had never before been successfully defied by people he considered his inferiors. Whatever the reason, Colonel Theodore Hartwell made the decision that would destroy him. Bring up the cannon, he ordered his artillery sergeant, a grizzled veteran who had served with distinction in the Indian Wars but had never been asked to shell a mine containing American civilians. I want that position reduced to rubble within the hour. The mountain howitzer was a small field piece designed for mobility rather than destructive power, but in the confined space of the canyon, it would be devastatingly effective. Samuel watched the gun crew positioning their weapon, and felt the cold calculation of a soldier who understood that the tactical situation had just shifted dramatically. "They're bringing up artillery," he reported to Rose and Grey Wolf. "Once that cannon opens fire, these tunnels won't provide much protection." Rose checked her ammunition for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit that Samuel recognized from his own military service. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes. They'll want to get the range exactly right before they start the bombardment." Grey Wolf had been studying the terrain above the canyon through a pair of field glasses liberated from one of Hartwell's wounded trackers. Now he lowered the glasses with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been grim anticipation. "There's another option," he said quietly. "But it's dangerous, and if it fails, we all die." Samuel waited for elaboration. In his experience, Apache tactical thinking often involves solutions that conventional military training would never consider. "The canyon walls," Grey Wolf continued, "they're not as stable as they look. Too much mining activity, too many blasting charges over the years. The right kind of explosion in the right place could bring down half the north wall. Bury ourselves along with them. Or bury them and create a dam that blocks the canyon mouth, force Hartwell to withdraw or find another way around, which would take days." Rose understood immediately. "You're talking about bringing down thousands of tons of rock. How do we survive that?" "The drainage tunnel." Grey Wolf pointed toward an opening in the mine wall that Samuel had noticed but dismissed as too small to be useful. "It leads back into the mountain, connects to the old ventilation system. If we time it right, we can trigger the rock slide and escape through the back passages before the canyon fills with debris." Samuel studied the proposed escape route with the eye of someone who had spent years evaluating military engineering. The drainage tunnel was narrow, partially collapsed in places, and completely unmapped beyond the first 100 yards. Following it deeper into the mountain would be like entering a maze with no guarantee of finding an exit. "It's suicide," he said flatly. "So is staying here," Rose pointed out. "At least this way we have a chance." The sound of the howitzer's wheels rolling over the stone echoed through the canyon as Hartwell's artillery crew moved their weapon into firing position. Samuel could see the colonel himself directing the placement, ensuring that the first shots would have maximum psychological as well as physical impact. "What do you need to bring down the wall?" he asked Grey Wolf. "Dynamite, lots of it, and someone who knows enough about mining engineering to place the charges where they'll do the most good." "I worked in silver mines before I joined the cavalry," Samuel said quietly. "Learned blasting from experts who could split granite with surgical precision." Rose looked at both men with the expression of someone who had just realized that the people she cared about most were planning something that would probably get them all killed. "This is insane, sir." "Probably," Samuel agreed. "But insane plans sometimes work when rational ones fail, and right now we're out of rational options." They spent the next 15 minutes gathering every stick of dynamite from the mine's abandoned supplies and rigging it according to Samuel's hastily drawn diagrams. The charges had to be placed precisely timed to create a cascading failure that would bring down the maximum amount of rock while allowing them enough time to reach the drainage tunnel before the collapse blocked their escape route. "Ready?" Samuel asked, his hand on the plunger of the detonator they had improvised from mining equipment. Rose and Grey Wolf nodded, both of them already moving toward the drainage tunnel entrance. Outside the mine, they could hear Colonel Hartwell's voice shouting orders to his artillery crew. "Fire when ready." Samuel pushed the plunger. The explosion that followed was unlike anything he had experienced even during the heaviest artillery bombardments of the Civil War. The dynamite charges detonated in sequence, each blast triggering geological forces that had been building pressure for decades. Cracks appeared in the canyon wall, spreading like lightning across the granite face, and then entire sections of rock began to shift and fall. The three fugitives ran through the drainage tunnel as the mountain came apart behind them. Dust and debris filled the air, making breathing difficult and navigation nearly impossible. Samuel led by feel, following the tunnel deeper into the earth, while behind them, the sound of falling rock grew to a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the entire world. When silence finally returned, they found themselves in absolute darkness, deep underground, with no idea whether their gamble had succeeded or whether Colonel Hartwell and his 40 men were digging through tons of rubble to reach them. "Everyone alive?" Samuel asked. "Bruised but functional," Rose replied. "The same," Grey Wolf confirmed. "Did it work?" Samuel listened carefully, trying to detect any sounds of human activity from the direction they had come. Nothing but the settling of rock and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead. "I think we buried the bastards," he said with satisfaction. But even as he spoke, Samuel realized that their problems were far from over. They were trapped in an unmapped tunnel system deep underground, with limited supplies and no certainty that they would find another way out before they died of thirst or starvation. Rose seemed to read his thoughts. "At least we're dying free instead of in chains." "We're not dying at all," Grey Wolf said firmly. "Apache people have been hiding in mountains for generations. These tunnels have to connect to natural cave systems, and all cave systems eventually lead to the surface." Samuel hoped his new brother-in-law was right, but he kept his doubts to himself as they began the long journey deeper into the mountain, guided only by hope in the stubborn refusal to surrender that had brought them this far. They emerged from the mountain 3 days later, half a mile from where the silver mine had been blinking in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after 72 hours of absolute darkness. The journey through the tunnel system had been a nightmare of narrow passages, false turns, and constant uncertainty. But Grey Wolf's confidence in Apache knowledge of mountain geology had proved justified. Natural springs had provided water, and their emergency rations had lasted just long enough to sustain them until they found the cave opening that led back to the world above. The first thing they saw was smoke rising from Devil's Canyon. Samuel studied the scene through Grey Wolf's field glasses, trying to understand what had happened after the rock slide. The north wall of the canyon had indeed collapsed, creating a massive dam of broken granite that completely blocked the original passage. But instead of retreating, Hartwell had apparently decided to make camp and wait for his quarry to emerge from whatever bolt hole they had found. "He knows we're alive," Rose observed. "Smart man," Samuel admitted grudgingly. "Probably figured we had an escape route plan and positioned his men to cover the likely exits." "How many survived the rock slide?" Samuel reassessed the enemy strength around the distant camp. "Maybe 20. We cut his force in half, but that's still more men than we can fight directly." Grey Wolf had been studying the terrain with the eye of a warrior who had spent his life planning ambushes and raids. "He's made a mistake, though. Look at how he's positioned his camp." Samuel and Rose followed Grey Wolf's gaze toward the cavalry encampment. Hartwell had chosen a defensible position in the center of a broad meadow with good fields of fire in all directions and water from a stream that ran down from the higher elevations. From a conventional military standpoint, it was an excellent choice. "He's thinking like a cavalry officer," Grey Wolf continued. "Open ground room for his horses to maneuver protection from surprise attack. But he's not thinking like someone who understands Apache tactics." "What do you see that he doesn't?" Samuel asked. "The stream. It comes down through a narrow gorge before it reaches the meadow. Control the gorge and you control the water supply. Force him to come to you instead of letting him choose when and where to fight." Rose nodded slowly. "Cut off his water and then he has to either attack uphill through a narrow passage or retreat completely. Either way, he loses the advantages of superior numbers and cavalry training." Samuel felt a familiar surge of admiration for the tactical thinking that had made the Apaches such formidable opponents during the Indian Wars, where conventional military doctrine emphasized holding ground and maintaining supply lines. Apache strategy focused on mobility, surprise, and forcing the enemy to fight on terms that negated their numerical advantages. "There's something else," he said, studying Hartwell's camp more carefully. "He's got guards posted sentries walking regular patrols, but he's not expecting an immediate attack. He thinks we're still trapped underground or recuperating from our escape. That gives us an advantage if we move quickly." They spent the rest of the day moving into position, following game trails and natural features that provided concealment while they approached the gorge that controlled access to Hartwell's water supply. By nightfall, they had established themselves in positions that dominated the stream and the narrow passage through which any relief force would have to advance. Samuel took the first watch, settling into a position among the rocks that provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire toward the cavalry camp. Rose and Grey Wolf found their own positions close enough to coordinate their actions, but far enough apart that a single attack couldn't eliminate all three defenders. The night passed quietly, broken only by the normal sounds of men and horses in a military camp and the occasional call of sentries confirming that all was well. Samuel found himself thinking about the events that had brought him to this place, from the moment he had put a rifle under his chin to the complex chain of circumstances that had made him part of an Apache war party planning an attack on a corrupt cavalry colonel. 6 months ago, the idea would have seemed impossible. Samuel Mackenzie, loyal soldier and grieving widower, allied with the very people he had spent years fighting, risking his life to protect an Apache woman who had become more important to him than his own survival. But the man who had carved 17 music boxes for the dead was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the living deserved protection more than the dead deserved monuments. Dawn brought movement from Hartwell's camp. The colonel had apparently decided that waiting for his quarry to emerge was less productive than actively hunting them, and he was preparing to send out search parties to comb the surrounding mountains. Samuel watched the preparations through his field glasses, counting men and weapons, noting the deployment patterns that would leave the main camp most vulnerable. "He's splitting his force," he reported to Rose and Grey Wolf, "sending out 3 search parties of 5 men each. That leaves maybe 8 men in the main camp, plus Hartwell himself." "Better odds," Rose observed. "Much better. But we need to eliminate the search parties before they can report back or provide reinforcement." Grey Wolf smiled with the anticipation of a hunter who had spotted vulnerable prey. "Leave the search parties to me. I'll make sure they don't report anything to anyone." Samuel nodded, understanding that his Apache ally was volunteering for the most dangerous part of their plan. Taking on 15 professional soldiers in the broken terrain of the high country would require all the skill and stealth that Grey Wolf had learned during years of warfare against superior numbers. "Rose and I will take the main camp," Samuel said. "Wait for your signal, then hit them hard and fast before they can organize a defense." "What signal?" Grey Wolf pointed toward a peak that overlooked both the camp and the areas where the search parties would be operating. "When you see smoke from that ridge, you'll know the search parties are no longer a problem." They separated before full daylight, each moving toward their assigned objectives, with the careful patience of people who understood that haste could be fatal in situations where everything depended on timing and surprise. Samuel and Rose worked their way down through the rocks and timber toward positions that would allow them to observe Hartwell's camp while remaining concealed until the moment came to attack. From their hiding place, Samuel could see Colonel Hartwell clearly for the first time since the siege began. The man looked older than Samuel remembered, his hair gone gray at the temples and his face marked by the kind of stress that came from conducting operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. But his bearing remained military, his movements still carried the authority of command, and his eyes held the cold intelligence that had made him successful in both legitimate and criminal enterprises. "That's him," Rose whispered, following Samuel's gaze. "The man who bought me like livestock and tried to break me like a horse." Samuel heard the anger in her voice, but also the control. Rose had learned to manage her emotions, to use her fury as a tool, rather than letting it use her. It was a skill that would serve her well in the violence that was coming. The morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of smoke from Grey Wolf's position. Samuel began to worry that his Apache ally had encountered more resistance than expected, that the search parties had proved more formidable than their small numbers suggested. But he maintained his position, trusting in Grey Wolf's skills and understanding that premature action could destroy their only chance at success. Finally, just as the sun began to decline toward the western peaks, a thin column of smoke rose from the designated ridge. Grey Wolf's signal confirming that the search parties had been eliminated and that the odds in the main camp were now in their favor. "Ready?" Samuel asked Rose. She checked her rifle one final time, ensuring that the action was clear and the ammunition was properly seated. "I've been ready for 3 months." They rose from concealment and began their approach to Hartwell's camp, moving with the coordinated precision of 2 people who had learned to trust each other completely. Samuel took the point, using his military experience to identify the best routes and avoid the casual observation of sentries who weren't expecting an attack from this direction. The first guard died without a sound, Grey Wolf's knife finding its target before the man could raise an alarm. The second sentry turned at the sound of Samuel's approach and managed to open his mouth before Rose's rifle bullet silenced him permanently. Then they were in the camp itself, moving between tents and supply wagons toward the command post where Colonel Hartwell was studying maps and planning the next phase of his manhunt. Samuel could hear the colonel's voice giving orders to his remaining men, directing them to prepare for extended operations in the high country. "Colonel Hartwell," Samuel called out as he stepped into the command tent, his rifle leveled at the man who had caused so much suffering. "We need to talk." Hartwell turned slowly, his hand moving toward the pistol on his belt, but stopping when he saw Rose enter behind Samuel, her own weapon trained on his chest. The Apache woman, Hartwell said with satisfaction, and the mountain man who's been harboring a fugitive from federal authority. You've saved me considerable trouble by coming here. Federal authority, Adi. Samuel laughed. Is that what you call kidnapping and trafficking women and children? I call it maintaining order in a lawless territory. These people need to understand their place in the new order, and sometimes that requires firm measures. Rose stepped forward, her rifle never wavering. Your firm measures included 3 months of torture and rape followed by selling me to a collector of human curiosities. You're being dramatic. I was preparing you for a role that would have provided security and comfort for the rest of your life. Many women would be grateful for such an opportunity. Samuel felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to volunteer for suicide missions during the war. Grateful for slavery, grateful for civilization, for the chance to serve something greater than their own primitive instincts. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from outside the tent. Grey Wolf had apparently encountered resistance from the remaining guards, and the careful stealth of their approach was giving way to open combat. Rose said flatly, "Your men are dead or dying," Rose said flatly, "just like your trafficking operation, just like your reputation, just like everything you've built on the suffering of innocent people." Samuel heard something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. Rose was trembling not with fear, but with the effort of controlling rage that threatened to consume her completely. Her finger was white on the rifle trigger, and Samuel realized that she was seconds away from ending Colonel Hartwell's life in the most direct way possible. "Rose," he said quietly, "don't. He needs to die. Yes, he does, but not like this." "Why not like this?" Samuel moved closer to her, careful not to block her line of fire, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Because you're better than he is. Because killing him in cold blood makes you like him, and you're nothing like him. He destroyed my family, tortured me for months, turned me into property to be bought and sold. I know, and he'll pay for all of that, but through justice, not revenge, through exposing his crimes and making sure everyone knows what kind of man he really is." Rose's rifle trembled as she fought the internal battle between vengeance and justice, between the immediate satisfaction of pulling the trigger and the longer-term goal of destroying Hartwell's entire operation. Colonel Hartwell watched this exchange with growing confidence. "You don't have the stomach for what needs to be done, do you? Too civilized, too soft, too concerned with appearances to make the hard choices." "No," Samuel said, never taking his eyes off Rose. "We're concerned with being the kind of people who deserve to win." The gunfire outside was slowing individual shots now instead of the sustained volleys that marked pitched battle. Grey Wolf was apparently gaining control of the situation, eliminating the last of Hartwell's guards, with the methodical efficiency that had made Apache warriors legendary throughout the frontier. "It's over, Colonel," Samuel said. "Your men are dead, your operation is exposed, and federal investigators are already asking questions you won't be able to answer. You think this ends anything? I have connections throughout the territorial government, friends in Washington, who understand the necessity of my work. This is a minor setback, nothing more." Rose lowered her rifle slightly, the immediate crisis of whether to shoot Hartwell passing as she realized Samuel was right about the value of keeping him alive. "Maybe, but when the newspapers publish the stories about your trafficking ring, when every detail of your operation becomes public knowledge, those friends will disappear faster than morning mist. No one will believe the word of a savage woman and a mountain hermit over a decorated cavalry officer. They'll believe the word of federal marshals and newspaper editors and the dozens of witnesses who can testify about your crimes," Samuel said. "Jake Morrison already sent out the telegraph messages. By now, half the territory knows what you've been doing." For the first time since they had entered his tent, Colonel Hartwell looked uncertain. The confidence that had sustained him through years of criminal activity was beginning to crack as he realized that his carefully constructed network of corruption and secrecy was collapsing around him. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Justice," Rose said simply. "For me, for my family, for every woman and child you've trafficked, for every life you've destroyed in service of your greed." Samuel nodded toward the tent entrance where Grey Wolf had appeared with his rifle trained on the colonel and blood on his hands that belonged to men who had chosen to serve evil for money. "Time to go, Colonel. You have some explaining to do." The journey back to civilization took 4 days. 4 days during which Colonel Theodore Hartwell was forced to confront the reality of his situation. Bound and mounted on one of his own horses, surrounded by three people who had every reason to kill him and considerable skill in making death look accidental, he had time to consider how quickly a man's fortunes could change in the unforgiving country of the American frontier. Samuel had decided to take Hartwell to Denver rather than the closer territorial offices in Colorado Springs. Denver had federal marshals who weren't on anyone's payroll, newspaper editors who weren't afraid of powerful men, and enough distance from Hartwell's immediate sphere of influence that justice might actually be possible. Rose rode beside their prisoner, never speaking to him directly, but watching him with the patient attention of someone who had learned not to trust appearances when it came to dangerous men. Grey Wolf scouted ahead and behind, ensuring that they weren't walking into an ambush, prepared by whatever allies Hartwell might still have in the region. On the second day of their journey, they encountered a party of federal marshals riding toward the mountains with warrants and questions. Jake Morrison's telegraph messages had indeed reached the right people, and the territorial government was finally being forced to investigate reports of corruption that had been ignored for too long. Marshal William Hayes, a lean man with intelligent eyes and 20 years of experience in frontier law enforcement, listened to their story with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between justice and vengeance. He examined the evidence they had gathered, interviewed Rose about her experiences, and questioned Hartwell about his activities with the methodical thoroughness of a professional investigator. "This is going to be a complex prosecution," he warned them as they made camp on the third night. "Hartwell has connections throughout the territorial administration, friends who will work to protect him, lawyers who specialize in making inconvenient cases disappear." "Will that be enough to save him?" Rose asked. "Not this time. The newspaper stories have created too much public attention, and Washington is sending investigators who answer directly to the federal government. Hartwell's local connections won't help him with charges of trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy." Samuel felt a deep satisfaction at the marshal's words. Justice might be slow and uncertain, but it was finally moving in the right direction. "What about the other women and children, the ones who were trafficked before Rose?" "We'll find them. This investigation is going to expose the entire network, from the buyers in eastern cities to the corrupt officials who made it possible. It may take months or years, but we'll find them and bring them home." That night, as Rose sat by the fire working on a piece of carving that had begun to look like a bird in flight, Samuel realized that their story was approaching something that might be called an ending. Not the ending he had planned 6 months ago when he put a rifle under his chin, but an ending that involved hope instead of despair, justice instead of revenge, the possibility of a future worth living instead of a past too painful to remember. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "The 18th music box. I think I finally know what melody it should play." "What melody is that?" "Something hopeful, something that celebrates the living instead of mourning the dead." Grey Wolf looked up from where he was maintaining his weapons. "And after Denver, after the trial and the newspapers, and the federal investigators finished their work, what then?" Samuel looked at Rose, seeing in her face the same question that had been occupying his own thoughts. They had been brought together by crisis and danger, forged into something approaching a partnership by shared adversity and common enemies. But what would happen when the immediate threats were gone, when they had to decide what kind of life to build in a world that wasn't actively trying to kill them? "I'd like to go back to the mountain," Samuel said finally. "Not to hide from the world, but to build something worth protecting. A place where people like Rose's family can find safety when they need it, a refuge for anyone who's running from the kind of evil that Hartwell represents." "A sanctuary," Rose said thoughtfully. "Someplace that belongs to the people who need it most." "Exactly. And maybe someplace where a man can make music boxes that celebrate life instead of apologizing for death." Grey Wolf smiled, the first completely relaxed expression Samuel had seen on his face. "My sister could do worse than a man who thinks in terms of building instead of destroying." "Your sister can speak for herself," Rose said with mock severity. "But she happens to agree with both of you." The trial of Colonel Theodore Hartwell became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in the history of the Colorado Territory. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New York came to cover the story of government corruption and human trafficking that had operated for years under the protection of official authority. Rose testified for 3 days, describing her experiences with calm precision that made her account more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. Samuel provided background on Hartwell's military career and the systematic nature of his criminal activities. Grey Wolf spoke about the broader impact on Apache communities, the families destroyed and lives ruined by trafficking operations that treated human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The defense attempted to portray Hartwell as a dedicated public servant who had made difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. They questioned Rose's credibility, suggested that Samuel was motivated by personal animosity, implied that Grey Wolf was part of a conspiracy to discredit legitimate government policies toward Native American populations. None of it worked. The evidence was too extensive, the testimony too detailed, the pattern of corruption too clear to be explained away by legal maneuvering. Federal investigators had uncovered financial records, correspondence with buyers, official documents that had been forged or falsified to provide legal cover for criminal activities. Colonel Theodore Hartwell was convicted on 17 counts of kidnapping, trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption of federal officials. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with the possibility of additional charges as investigators continued to uncover the full scope of his activities. More importantly, the trial exposed the network of corruption that had made his crimes possible. 7 territorial officials were removed from office. Federal oversight of Indian agencies was strengthened, and new laws were passed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under the old system. Rose found herself something of a celebrity, invited to speak at churches and civic organizations about her experiences and the broader issues of human trafficking and government corruption. She accepted some of these invitations, understanding that her story could help prevent similar crimes and assist other survivors in finding their voices. But she always returned to the mountain, to the cabin that Samuel had expanded into something approaching a small ranch, to the life they were building together in the high country of Colorado Territory. The 18th music box was completed on a warm day in September when the aspen trees were turning gold and the high meadows were filled with wildflowers that would soon disappear beneath the first snows of winter. Samuel had carved Rose's Apache name into the walnut case, along with intricate patterns that represented the meeting of two worlds and the possibility of harmony between different peoples. The melody he chose was one that Rose had taught him, an Apache song about the renewal of life after the hardest winters, the return of hope after the darkest times. When he wound the key and let the music play, it filled their cabin with sounds that spoke of survival and resilience and the kind of love that could bridge any gap between different worlds. "It's beautiful," Rose said, holding the music box like something precious. "It's for us, for what we've built together, for what we're going to build in the years ahead." She kissed him then, soft and warm and full of promises that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future they would create together. "Samuel," Rose said quietly, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach, "there's something else we need to talk about." He looked at her questioningly. "I'm carrying a child. I don't know if it's—" She paused. "If it's from Hartwell or if it's ours, but I know I want to raise it here with you as our child." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he thought of another child, another time, another woman who had carried his hopes for the future in her womb. But this was different. This was about choosing love over fear, about building something new instead of mourning something lost. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Boy or girl, whatever blood runs in its veins, it will be our child. Raised with love, raised with freedom, raised to understand that the past doesn't have to define the future." Outside their cabin, the Colorado mountains stretched toward horizons that held more possibilities than either of them could have imagined, when a woman's scream interrupted a man's suicide and changed both their lives forever. Grey Wolf had established his own place in the valley below Samuel's cabin, where he served as liaison between the growing community of Apache refugees and the federal officials who were working to address the injustices of the past. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress of the kind that came from people of goodwill, working together instead of against each other. On quiet evenings when the day's work was done and the mountain air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, the three of them would sit by the fire and plan for the future. Not just their personal futures, but the larger future of the sanctuary They were building the lives, they were trying to protect the world, they wanted to leave for the children who would come after them. Samuel Mackenzie, who had once carved 17 music boxes for the dead, now spent his time building furniture for the living. Rose Running Wolf, who had survived months of torture and degradation, now helped other survivors find their strength and reclaim their dignity. Grey Wolf, who had been a warrior fighting for his people's survival, now worked within the system to ensure that survival meant more than just staying alive. It wasn't the ending any of them had planned, but it was an ending that offered hope instead of despair, growth instead of decay, the possibility that even the most broken people could find ways to heal themselves and each other. And in the mountain cabin where it all began, the 18th music box played its hopeful melody, reminding everyone who heard it that the future was always possible for those brave enough to choose life over death, love over fear, and justice over revenge. Samuel Mackenzie had learned to live again, and in learning that lesson, he had helped others discover that survival was just the beginning of what was possible when people chose to stand together against the darkness that would always threaten to consume them. The mountain kept its own counsel about the small, warm lives that flourished in its shadow. But if mountains could approve, this one surely did.